My name is Armstrong Robinson. I'm your Vice President of Legislative Affairs here at AALU GAMA, and I am delighted to be joined this morning by Bridget McNamara from M Financial Holdings to talk about PPP loans, to keep them or not to keep them, to quote our friend Shakespeare. And do I have control? There we go. And there are our beautiful faces. If you can't see us in the screen, the glory headshots. Start remote control. There we go. All right. So a couple of housekeeping items. We're very excited to welcome you all to today's call. As a reminder, the subject matter we are discussing today is changing, sometimes daily. We've covered it for you on a, I think, weekly basis for the last 7 or 8 weeks straight. And this is the latest edition, but we're giving you our best information as we have it, and we share it as soon as we get it. It is important to know, though, that webinars from AALU GAMA and comments from our presenters are intended for guidance and clarification around the intent and policy choices to better inform your own decisions. None of the following is intended as legal or tax counsel. And individuals should take this information and their own individual fact pattern and consult with their own counsel when making legal or compliance or tax decisions. This is an open webinar to the whole profession. Should we have any member of the press here listening, we welcome you also. But if you would like to talk about this in any greater detail, please contact my friend and colleague, no relation, Armstrong at AALU.org. I get the slide to roll forward. Courtney, Molly, I'm having difficulty rolling the slides. Bridget, I'm sorry for our technical challenges here. Molly, can you take back control and do this for me?
There we go.
There we go. All right. No, I think we skipped several. This is slide 5. Now we're on 7. Okay. Yeah, it is delayed. All right. We have skipped well ahead, Molly and Courtney. We need to go back to the beginning. Let me talk for a minute while we get back to the right place. The PPP program, as you all know, didn't exist in March, or it was created at the end of March. It was created in haste. The earliest reference I was able to find to the concept was a Marco Rubio press release from March 12th. It was included in the CARES Act that the president signed into law on March 27th. So you have basically 15 days from concept to enactment. And as I think you all know, the very first loans were made on April 3rd. That is an incredibly fast time by any standard. And in doing so, Congress's rush to, this is the slide we want to be on, slide 4. Congress's rush to really extend this bridge loan to small businesses and to the small businesses' employees meant that they stripped away a lot of the traditional SBA controls that were used and as to who could qualify. So you have the history, as you know, as ludicrous as that is for something that isn't a year old yet. But this is where we are. And through May 6th, they have made 4.1 million loans worth a total of $526 billion. By one estimate, that total is more than 20 times the largest year in SBA history, completed in 33 days. The other thing that happened, and as you all know, we have focused mostly in our webinars on borrower guidance. The lender guidance and the lenders have increased tenfold. A friend of mine in Kelly Kidwell's firm has this neat slide where he shows the number of available lenders on April 3rd was measured at like 500 and something. and 2 weeks later, it was over 5,000. So you have, millions of borrowers and now thousands of participating lenders. The key in all of this, I think it's really important to remember, is the purpose and legislative intent from beginning to end was to extend liquidity for small businesses and support their payrolls during what I am now calling the induced economic coma designed to control for the COVID-19 healthcare crisis. And I think that's an important frame as we walk through today's presentation. If we can go to the next slide, pardon me. In the last 2 or 3 weeks, a series of events have led to the title of our webinar, which is to keep or not to keep the PPP, as Treasury and the SBA have issued guidance. Nope, go the other direction. Bear with us, we'll get there, everybody. So as Treasury sought to respond to press reports about certain people taking loans who the public discussion deemed it was inappropriate that they had done so, and so they sought to issue guidance to curtail that behavior. In combination with that, some borrowers or applicants have gotten threatening letters from their lender about the fraud standards. And then there's obviously the issue, which we'll talk about in terms of FINRA and the SEC and disclosure writ large. The key function in all of our discussion turns on this primary certification you had to make when you made your loan. In order to qualify, you had to certify in good faith that current economic uncertainty makes this loan request necessary to support the ongoing operations of the applicant, and connecting that to the primary purpose of supporting your payroll. That has led to our recommendation very strongly that all applicants should document as close to the time they made the loan or with facts present when the loan application was made, the conclusions that led to your certification of economic necessity or economic uncertainty, and especially helpful as relates to maintaining your employees' payroll, or for those of you on the phone who are dealing with sole proprietorships, are yourselves independent contractors or statutory W-2s, then obviously that's a more personal declaration based on your anticipated business income. We can go to the next slide. Has it popped up on, is it just minus? There we go. Moving goalposts. As I said, the speed with which this is rolled out, they've lent out $526 billion, and they are still issuing guidance on how you can take it and whether you, or how you should spend it. It is a necessary function of trying to put out this much money this quickly. Since the CARES Act became law on March 27th, the SBA and the Treasury have published 9 interim final rules and released 45 frequently asked questions in 16 separate batches. These are intended to provide clarifying guidance to borrowers and lenders who are participating in the program, but as discussed, some of this guidance has led to substantial confusion. And I want to talk about one in particular, or 2 in particular in that frame. If we can go to the next slide. Okay, so we're having a lag time issue. It must be heavy internet. The return safe harbor, which is the other reason for the webinar today, has been extended through May 14th. When they did that extension, they promised additional guidance about clarifying the economic necessity standard. To date, as of this morning, we haven't seen that. So we may see an additional extension of this guidance from May 14th beyond. We'll see. And certainly as soon as we get that guidance, we will share it with you. One of the key pieces, going back to the earliest days, publicly traded companies have different disclosure rules of their own. And so that, I'm not an expert in that, but that's part of how Shake Shack and some of the big other publicly traded companies who had applied were revealed and then questioned as to whether or not they should have taken part in this. according to one press report, in response to the guidance and the backlash on Shake Shack and Ruth's Chris and some others, so far, 48 loans have been returned by publicly traded companies worth more than $350 million. But one of the things Bridget and I will come back to many, many times today is that application of all these standards is highly dependent on the individual facts and circumstances of the particular applicant. So whether you're doing this for yourself or for your client, and whether you're applying the standards of the PPP or the SEC or of FINRA, you need to, it's going to depend on your individual circumstances, and what I might have done may not be the same in any way, shape, or form, or influence what Bridget may have done, and vice versa. I mean, just using us as examples. I'm obviously not an applicant in all this. If we can go to the next slide. Because the publicly traded piece, so one of the things that is absolutely clear from the beginning is that in normal times, the SBA required you to demonstrate that you had exhausted other credit markets in order to apply for SBA-backed loans. That requirement was specifically suspended for the PPP. It is not a requirement of your qualification that you have exhausted other credit facilities. Some of the guidance begs the question of whether you have access to equity markets for additional liquidity or additional cash flows. And so what has sometimes been known, and the reason we want to go through this specifically is it's important to look at actually what the Treasury has said and not what a press report says about it, right? Because they end up shorthanding stuff. And so this has become known as in some circles as the publicly traded company FAQ, which is number 31, released on April 23rd. The actual question, as Treasury posed it, was whether businesses owned by large corporations with adequate sources of liquidity to support the business's ongoing operations qualify for a PPP loan. And the answer, and this is all direct quotes, is all borrowers must assess, and then borrowers must make good faith certification, taking into account their current business activity, their ability to access other sources of liquidity sufficient to support ongoing operations in a manner that is not significantly detrimental to, now we're going to go to a slide, the operations of the business. This isn't, most of the people I talked to when this first came out found this guidance to be really confusing. But this is, I think the key parts here are in the example that they offer in this FAQ. And it's important to note exactly what they said. It says it's unlikely that a company with substantial market value and access to capital markets will be able to make the required certification in good faith. And as such a company should be prepared to demonstrate to the SBA upon request the basis for its certification, which comes back to, most of our audience are not publicly traded companies, but this is the standard they appear to be applying. It's what was your justification for your certification at the time you made the loan. And, you should be prepared. We'll talk throughout this about sort of the legal risks and reputational risks, but you should be prepared to defend why you made this declaration at the time you made it. Obviously, the world is changing a lot. The economy is changing a lot day by day and week to week. And if you made your loan application on April 3rd or 5th or 10th, that may be different than how you feel or what you know today or will know in 3 weeks. And it's the determination when you made the declaration and certification. And as I note here again, it is not a standard that you had to exhaust other credit markets or other borrowing options. If we can go to the next slide. Disclosure. So there are two parts to the disclosure that I want to emphasize here, and this is where I really want to bring in Bridget on the next slide. But here, you should expect if you take a PPP loan that your name, along with all the others, will be disclosed. Senator Rubio, an architect of the PPP, has made that declaration, as has the Secretary of the Treasury, Secretary Mnuchin. Um, I don't know when this will become available, and I would expect whether the government provides it in a searchable database or not, some press outlet, if they don't, or Public Sunshine Group will make it a searchable database. So if you take this loan, you should expect that at some point, someday, you will be disclosed as having done so. If we can go to the next slide, because we want to talk a little bit about what the SEC and FINRA have said. And Bridget, if I can bring you in, what I've done
Sure.
here is provided the exact language that FINRA and the SEC have offered.
Sure. So the exact language that FINRA and the SEC have utilized in terms of disclosure are in many ways appear on their face to be conflictual and of alternative guidance. So FINRA was asked the question as to whether the individual that had taken a loan is required to provide the answer or provide that information as a disclosure on the U4, which would be a disclosure that would be public. And the U4 asked a question about whether the individual that is the subject of the U4 has had a compromise with the creditor. And the compromise with the creditor is the key there, because the, let's move the slide forward one more. The issue here turns on the word compromise. Compromise, this is not seen as a compromise with a creditor because the loans that are being given contemplate forgiveness of some or all of the loan as an original part of the term of that loan. So therefore, that forgiveness is not going to be seen as a compromise. And therefore, they're saying that in those circumstances, the forgiveness of the loan is not a compromise for purposes of U4. And any forgiveness that's beyond the original terms of the loan could be seen as a compromise with creditors. But for the most part, FINRA is giving the guidance that if you're using this loan in the manner that it is anticipated that it should be used, then you will not need to disclose anything on the U4. Now, keep in mind that Army started this by saying that, this webinar by saying that there have been that the SBA moved and the government moved incredibly quickly to get these loans out into the marketplace. And as they were contemplating the PPP, I am sure they didn't stop to say, well, what specific issues do we have in various industries that we need to parse through and provide guidance on in advance? That's what is giving rise to a lot of the confusion after the fact. Any of the firms that are providing or receiving these loans are not necessarily subject to the level of regulatory scrutiny and disclosure that you would find in a broker-dealer or RIA situation or any registered rep or investment advisor rep. Can we move forward to the next slide? Which then takes us to the issue of the SEC. So the SEC had a question in their guidance that said, I'm a small advisory firm. I meet the requirements of the PPP that were established by the SBA. And if I receive or have received a loan, what are my regulatory reporting obligations under the Investment Advisors Act to my firm's clients? Excuse me a second, I'm gonna turn off my other computer's sound system so you don't have to hear that. Okay, let's move forward here. So the answer has actually given rise to more questions than it has answers. So if I could ask you to move the slide forward to the next slide. So the SEC said, and the SEC based this off of the existing instructions on the Form ADV, which basically says you're a fiduciary under federal law with your clients, and therefore you must make full and fair disclosure to your clients of all material facts relating to the advisory relationship. So there are a number of qualifiers in that particular sentence. As a fiduciary, you must make full and fair disclosure. That sounds pretty straightforward. However, we also say that it goes on to say all material facts, what is material, that relate to the advisory relationship. What is it that relates to advisory relationship? So then the answer goes on with a number of if-then situations. If the circumstances lend you that lead you to seek the loan, give rise to the advisory relationship and are considered material, then you should disclose. So the question then goes to, as Army said earlier, it very much becomes a facts and circumstances decision as to whether you need to disclose this loan. If it is going to underscore your ability to maintain your relationship with the clients, if it is material to continuing your advisory relationship to the clients, then the SEC says you should disclose it. If it is not, perhaps you got the loan for a number of other reasons, but your firm is not subject to completely folding by receipt of the loan, then you shouldn't need to disclose it. However, then you go back to the original language that Army highlighted several slides back, and I would have you go back to those, but we've got a slide delay going on, so we'll stay on this slide. The borrowers have to meet the qualifications and certify that they needed this for the ongoing operations of the business. So those two instructions are a bit in conflict with each other. However, the SEC, by giving this advice, they've issued several areas where it says to me that there are instances in which these loans do not need to be disclosed. It's a facts and circumstances. It's a facts and circumstances case that you have to consider. They use several if-then requirements. If the circumstances lead you to seek the loan, constitute material facts. Is it material? Are the loans being primarily to support the advisory relationship? In other words, those individuals that are supporting the client, supporting the advice, then you may have some requirements here. So it becomes such a gray area that, as Army also said at the outset of this, we are not here to give any legal, tax, payroll advice, but we would encourage anyone that is considering either taking the loan or keeping the loan or returning the loan to really look at your particular facts and circumstances, seek your own counsel, and make your decision based upon that. And as Army said, very, very important to have that documented because you want to be able to show the rationale for seeking the loan, the use of the loan, and why it was, if you choose not to disclose, why it was determined to fall under some of those exclusionary clauses that we see in the SEC FAQs. One other thing that I think is important to highlight here is that the SEC, while they've issued these FAQs, they also disclaim them and say these are not new law. So this is supposed to provide guidance, but this is not law. So they could come back and adjust these FAQs as well. So we need to be careful with regard to those issues.
Well, and I think that's true in all of this, right? Bridget, I mean, as I've come to understand this since, Mark, our CEO, sent out his alert right after we saw this from the SEC, I guess that was now almost 2 weeks ago. Like we saw it and sent it out right away because we knew it was material. Sorry, I didn't mean to use a buzzword here. We knew it was relevant to so many in the profession. But as I've come to understand it further, it does seem, and correct me if I'm wrong, that this FAQ was intended to remind that the standard for the ADV hasn't changed.
Right.
And the question becomes, where we've seen guidance and you have to talk to your compliance folks within your RIA, but it's for, it is clear, I think, right? This is RIAs and IARs And there's some debate about whether it applies at the firm level or the IAR level. And you've got to work through it. But they haven't changed the standard. And the question comes, and I think if we go to the next slide, we throw these up. Is necessary, your certification, material in the disclosure, and the standard hasn't changed there. We talk about there are some interpretations, many of which I've seen within the membership, that say this is an RIA obligation sort of at the firm level, not as much an IAR, but I think all the RIAs are ultimately going to be giving guidance to their IARs, and so you need to work within your own process around that, and so you need to ask these questions. There are obviously some, and I think this is indicative of the language used in the SEC comment, right, Bridget? There are some small RIAs that only have a couple of people in them, and it's a much smaller operation, and then that may blur the lines. But if all the investment counselors are either partners or ICs in the business, and the loan was taken to support the payroll of the support staff, you might have a facts and circumstances that might lead you to conclude differently as to this than someone else.
I would agree with that, Army. I'd also say that if you go back to the instructions that are on the Form ADV, they talk about the need as a fiduciary for you to give full and fair disclosure of all material facts that may impact the advisory relationship. I actually believe that is much more instructive than some of the SEC FAQs, because that is the standard that all IARs and RIAs have. So is it full and fair disclosure? Is it material? I would argue that necessary does not equal material, or they could have used the exact same language and they didn't. Is it supportive of maintaining the advisory relationship? So again, speak with your compliance people, speak with your counsel, and apply the definitions. I would say the SEC FAQs can help you in that regard, but apply the definitions that are on the Form ADV as it is to really analyze your own situation. Army, you also mentioned that there is debate about whether this applies at the registered investment advisor level, the firm level, or the investment advisory representative level. The way I read the language is it applies at the firm level, but then let's also think about, it applies at the firm level, but do you have an obligation under Form ADV 2B to make a disclosure with regard to the investment advisor representative? So perhaps what that means for the larger RIAs is, if you've got advisors out there that have taken the PPP loan, talk with them. What are the facts and circumstances around that particular loan, and determine whether that requires some kind of individual disclosure for that individual, completely separate from the facts and circumstances of the RIA.
Right. Let's go to the next slide. I want to, while we wait for the next slide to pop up, I want to address one thing that's gotten some feedback in here. There's been a couple of comments and questions about, is this just for big business? And the answer is no. We're here to serve you, but we can only tell you the guidance that's been given. So there isn't a guidance about a insurance producer or independent firm or a producer group firm or a career agency. Like that hasn't been the fact pattern that the SBA and Treasury have released. It's 45 questions thus far. They haven't gotten to that level of detail, and so we're left to interpret. I think we'll get to questions in a minute. We want to talk about some of the considerations. But I think you have to write down, as I started with, what were your considerations that led you to be comfortable signing the certification that this was economically necessary. And I know there are already a bunch of questions about, well, I thought it was economically necessary because of the way production works. My current income is based on work that began months ago, and looking into the future unknown, and not knowing how lead generation was going to work or was I going to be able to meet with clients. You had much greater uncertainty about that, and that perception may well have been one thing on April 3rd, another thing on May 3rd, and something entirely different on June 3rd. I think it comes down to, as I understand the rules, what was your reason when you made the application? So like on the date you certified, when you submitted the application, that's the mindset you want to memorialize and be specific about what your factors were that led to your conclusion. I think, as considerations go, um, there are clearly legal and reputational issues here. We've already seen, just to show you the spectrum of response, we've seen 48 publicly traded companies return loans. We've seen in one of the press reports yesterday, there was a story of a publicly traded company from Oregon that said, no, as we read the rules, we're perfectly in line with what Congress intended and what the guidance says. And so we're keeping our money to support our employees. And they were willing to say that publicly. Still, a third company quoted in the story said, it's clear they didn't think they were following the guidance, but they think the guidance isn't connected to the law. And so they're suing the government over it. Like, that's obviously the most egregious, or not egregious, that's the far end of the spectrum in terms of how aggressive you want to be. As I've said from the beginning, I think, and if you read the reports, they've started to interview former prosecutors who are now law firm partners, et cetera. Don't commit fraud. Be really clear about about meeting the intent of this program, which was to support you in this time of uncertainty and to support your employees through doing it. Bad faith and those standards, the one you may have seen a headline about the DOJ has launched a prosecution of somebody under the PPP program already. That's a fraud prosecution because they believe that the business in question reported and claimed employees they didn't have, right? The standard for I believed in good faith that I was in a situation of economic necessity and you think I wasn't is a different standard. It's a much more difficult thing to prove. Not that I'm you have to be comfortable there, right? As to how you went through it. But regardless of the SEC and the FINRA process, at some point or another, if you keep this money, you or your client will be disclosed by the Congress or the Treasury or the SBA, whoever ends up doing it, in a database. And so you will have reputational concerns. The other thing that's gotten people into trouble and led to some of the loans being returned were contemporaneous public statements that seemed to contradict their necessity. I don't remember which company it was, but they had a quarterly earnings report or quarterly earnings call of some sort, or shareholder call, like days before they applied for the loan, in which they depicted everything as being fantastic. And so the question became, so-and-so, you said on Tuesday that everything was fabulous, and on Friday you declared to the government that you needed their money for the economic necessity. Now, maybe something changed in those 3 days, or maybe it didn't, but that's where I think you're seeing the money. And the safe harbor, right? If you read what Treasury has said, it's provided as an avenue for people who should not have taken this money. So if you're comfortable with your rationale for having taken it, then I think there's lots of legitimate cases within the profession for why this is exactly what was intended by Congress to do. And there are many examples of people I talk to and our teams talk to all the time. So honor the intent of the program. And, I know we've got another webinar coming up Friday on like how to spend your money and everything else. We're getting as much guidance as we can to you, but the simple, good-natured intent here is to keep good records, right? Be very detailed about how you spend this money. And so, that's the other thing that I would recommend to you. Let me go to some questions here. Bridget, here's one. It says, what are the requirements for registered reps who are not an RIA or IAR?
Let me unmute myself so that I can answer the question. Then the SEC standard for RIAs does not apply. The FINRA U4 question is what applies. So you could have a U4 disclosure item if the loan is not used in a manner that is deemed to be a forgivable loan and ultimately forgiven. Then you could have what's considered a compromise with creditors, and that could be a U4 requirement. But if the loan is forgiven, then it's not a disclosable item on your U4.
Forgive my work from home background noise. If you are an independent insurance broker who's not a registrant with FINRA or the SEC, does any of this affect you?
That could go to state requirements, so it probably beyond the purview of my ability to answer in full. But I would say check with your counsel and your compliance people as to any particular state requirements. But if you're not subject to a U4 or a Form ADV, then certainly there'll be no disclosure items there.
That's great. So we covered that one. Let's see. Covered that. We have a report from our friend Christy Corrado about a C Corp from an insurance producer with a C Corp where they are the only employee. If they received a PPP, can they keep it for themselves or they have to return it under the safe harbor? Christy, as I mentioned to you in the chat box, I think we'd have to have a few more facts here, but I would think that they could if it was a legitimate business setup, then I would think that the rules would apply to them as it would to any other. And so if they were comfortable with their certifications, then I would say that probably, and again, this is one of the many reasons we don't provide legal advice. We're dealing with incomplete fact sets and we're not permitted to give legal advice. Two good reasons not to. But I'd say based on the fact pattern you presented, if the certifications are solid and the business format is legitimate, then there's no reason why they shouldn't be allowed to keep it. Let me see. Another question was the insurance business is typically a 2 to 3 month delay process from application to revenue, meaning our current revenue is based on applications for insurance from a couple of months ago before the COVID pandemic really hit hard. Our revenue is likely to suffer in the months ahead. So if we got a PPP loan, but have stayed afloat with those funds so far, how should we handle this? I think, as I commented before, and Bridget, I welcome your feedback on this. As I understand the standards, based on all the guidance we've gotten to date, it's what were the contributing inputs to your certification when you made the application, right? So you have to go back to the day that was, and if you didn't then, you should now go back and memorialize the inputs. And if you talk about your business income flows being on that kind of a delay, then that's what you would say. And if we're again back to the intent, what Congress was hoping was that you would say, if you were looking at that without the PPP, you might say, well, I can't rely on my revenue going forward, so I better furlough my employees now, or I might have to fire my employees now. And what they wanted you to do was to keep paying your employees. Mm-hmm. And so if at the time you were looking into that black hole and saying, I'm not sure what's going to happen, so that's why I applied for this loan in order to support my employees, and then you pay your employees, then I think, again, it's a good faith, bad faith standard. If you follow the intent, follow the rules, and do good documentation, then I think you should be okay. But you obviously, there are other considerations we've covered through this webinar, and you obviously have the option to return it if you no longer feel that it's worth it from any one perspective. I don't know, Bridget, if you have an additional thought.
I would agree with that, Army. I think it's very, it's pretty clear that the insurance industry does have a real lag between the initial proposal to a client and when the producer actually gets paid. You can show that through your business history. So that would be a part of the documentation that would go into what you've prepared on day one when you applied for the PPP loan. You're simply using good business historical data to determine that you could have a need, and not only could, but very likely would have a need for some income to keep your employees employed for a period of time until that lag is overcome.
Right. So I have another question here. It says, my question is, I took the loan for payroll, including mine, to the limit before they added language about need to have funds to sustain my business. There is language in the FAQ related to public companies that does suggest something about your cash liquidity. But even in that FAQ, they say if you had it, you need to be prepared to justify why it was necessary, right? And as we've talked about this with different people, the program should not, from our perspective, be designed to penalize people who did good financial planning on the front end, right? I think most of our audience probably has a permanent life insurance policy or several that they could tap for liquidity. That's not really the standard. I think but I admit there's a lot we don't know. I think it comes down to your individual input factors. If you might have looked at that situation and said, because of this uncertainty, I need to cut expenses and I need to reduce my payroll and cut salaries or lay some people off, then those are all inputs that lead, I think, very reasonably connected to the intent of the program around your economic uncertainty. But it very much is an independent determination based on your facts and circumstances. And as many of you are advising clients on this question, their facts and circumstances as well. Let me see some other questions here. Bridget, we've seen a couple more. Can you talk about the firm versus individual piece? And again, for everybody, this is SEC regulated entities under the RIA IAR standards. So if you're not in that group, this question doesn't necessarily apply to you, but what are the pushes and pulls or factors around the question as you see it, Bridget, as to the firm versus individual responsibility?
I think a large part of that, Army, depends upon the size of the RIA. If the RIA is basically a 1 or 2 person shop, a 10-person shop, a small RIA, it's very likely the analysis between the RIA and the IAR are going to be one and the same because their economic interests are so similar. And their economic reliance on the client relationship is so similar. But for a larger RIA, one that has several hundred IARs, the firm may decide that they would take a PPP loan for purposes of supporting the business, and they are not necessarily in a place where they feel like it would impact the advisory relationship. They're going to continue to provide, have advisors out there. That's a different set of facts and circumstances than the investment advisory representative who may have his or her own small advisory firm, and they are also applying for the PPP loan. So there's 2 separate applications. Then the investment advisory representative has to apply their own analysis of the ADV instructions, which is, as a fiduciary to your client, have you given full and fair disclosure of any circumstances that might affect the advisory relationship? So in those situations, any individual investment advisor rep that has applied for or received a PPP loan should speak to their RIA compliance people and talk about, I took the loan, or I'm planning to take the loan. This is the reason why. Let's determine whether this is something that needs to be disclosed or not. Two separate analyses I would purport.
Thanks, Christy, or thanks, Bridget. I wanted to offer a question as our last question from Christy. You know, ladies and gentlemen, we've had a lot of questions about this. We will certainly continue to try to provide you the very best in information from this. I've seen a number of things about whether we expect the safe harbor deadline to be extended again. I can't promise anything, but the notice that they issued last May 5th, which I guess was last Tuesday, said they were extending it to May 14th with the intent of providing additional guidance. They haven't provided additional guidance, so it's now Tuesday, the 14th is Thursday. They may extend it because that guidance hasn't been provided, but I can't guarantee that. As soon as the guidance is provided, we'll obviously produce an alert to the membership, and we will certainly, you know, if necessary and appropriate, schedule a follow-up webinar. The final question for you, Bridget, and thank you so much for your time today. Thank you all for attending. If a firm consists only of registered reps, should they return any loan amount that is believed to be over the forgivable amount to avoid the U4 disclosure? Any thoughts about what somebody should consider? I mean, that gets to specifics, but what would you advise somebody to consider in making that determination?
I think I would advise you to go and talk with your legal counsel about that, because if it's not forgivable, then it could very well be interpreted under the FINRA rules as a compromise with creditors and would be disclosable. Now, maybe you're fine with having that disclosure in your U4, but
well, isn't it still just a loan? If it's not forgivable, it's still just a loan. So there's no compromise, is there? I mean, I'm not an expert, but that's.
So that's a fair question, Army, and it's one that we've actually grappled with, because now all of a sudden that we have these requirements around the PPP loan, where is the slippery slope? Do you suddenly have to go to all of your registered reps, to all of your investment advisors, and say you must disclose every loan that you've ever taken out, and we need to determine whether it's disclosable? And that's a whole nother level that most broker dealers or RIAs have never gone to before. So it is an open question. And I think if the loan ends up being repaid, then it's not a compromise to creditors.
Right. So if it's not, to the question that I was posing, if it's not forgiven, if the amount that's not forgiven remains a loan and you pay it off, then it's not a compromise. You paid the loan off. I mean, that seems logical to me. And to your last point, Bridget, that's a question you've asked in your internal work, but that's never been the standard before, right?
No, it has not.
And I don't know that the intent of the SEC or FINRA was to fundamentally change standards forevermore, but that's why we're doing these webinars and talking to you about it, because some of the guidance has raised more questions, as Bridget said, than answers. I'm afraid we've come to the end of our time. I think we may have a thank you slide. And I want to thank you, Bridget, for joining me today. I couldn't have done this without you, and I really appreciate all the work that you put in and our partnership with them. Thank you all. Please continue to get us your questions and stay tuned for future webinars. Unifytheprofession.org. We've consolidated all our materials there. And so you can get the Action Center there. You can still, of course, go to your AALU.org or GAMAweb.com, but we are on our way to our new organization representing the whole profession, and we welcome you all to join us. Thank you very much, and have a wonderful Tuesday.
Thank you, Army.